Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, July 18th, 2018 edition of the Cluster API breakout meeting for SIG Lifecycle. Today, the first thing that just got added to the top of the agenda is asking about the Azure provider and whether or not we should try to make that an official Azure provider. So, Miguel, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working on this for the past about a month or two here at Platform 9, and it's I wouldn't call it mature, but there's some good functionality in it at the moment with the ability to take in those machine and cluster specs and actually create resources in Azure. And I have working controllers for those. And I'm just interested in knowing if there is any interest in actually making that the official provider, because I haven't seen any other work on any other Azure providers at the moment. So I'm just seeing what the community thinks about that.
I guess the first question will be, is anybody else on the call working on or interested in Azure provider? Were you going to say something, Chris?
Samsung's interested. I don't think we have any time for months. I mean, probably not until next year.
Do you have any objections to? So, we have a couple of agenda items coming up about creating the provider repos for different implementations, right? So Jason's got an issue about AWS, and I've got one for Google, and I put something on there that Dim's created one in the last week or so for OpenStack. Do you have any objections to seeding Cluster API provider Azure repo from the existing Platform 9 code, and then sort of jumping on that bandwagon when you guys do have bandwidth?
So as we discussed before, we'd like to have at least 2 people that have committed to working on the project, preferably from 2 organizations. I don't know that we can commit to working on that in a time frame that would qualify as being like, we're working on that. Like if I said in 6 months we're going to work on that, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in 6 months.
Yeah, I guess I was more asking from the perspective of, do you have any objections, assuming that we met those criteria, to using this to start, and then you guys contributing there once you're available, assuming you're still interested?
Absolutely not. I mean, we want to do everything community, with the community.
So you did sort of bring up the other question is, do we have sort of sufficient ownership for the SIG to maintain this repository? And I think that's the question we need to answer. Other than that, I'm not hearing any objections for using that code to start seeding the repository.
Okay, cool.
Hey guys, my name is Ashish, and this is my first time joining this meeting. I was curious to know if there are open issues or chunks of work that I can pick up as an individual and work on in my spare time and make contributions, not as part of any particular organization, but as just a developer.
Yes, so there is, if you go to the Cluster API repo and search for issues with the help wanted label, you'll see a number of, I think there are 10 right now, 10 open issues. I'll post a link into the meeting notes, where people have said, like, here's something we want to do, but I don't have the bandwidth to do it if someone else wants to come pick it up. And then there's also another label called Good First Issue, which is maybe a better place for sort of new contributors to get started. People have flagged things that are less complex or sort of easier to tackle as sort of the first thing you're doing, as opposed to just something where ideally we'd like somebody else to pick it up, but maybe it's complex or a large chunk of work, or you need to understand sort of the larger project context. So there are a number of those in the main Cluster API repo. if there's a specific environment or platform you're interested in working on, as we start sharding off things like OpenStack and AWS and GCP, we'll have similar lists of sort of first issues and help wanted issues in each of those repositories as well. So I pasted links to both those in the meeting notes, which is linked in chat if you didn't see that. Otherwise, I'll link it again. And go ahead and take a look at those and see if there's somewhere you want to get started. I will note that as an individual, you will need to like sign the CLA for the CNCF before any of your code can be accepted. So you want to make sure you've checked that box.
Sure. I didn't quite get the last bit. I'm on my phone on the bus, so I didn't get a chance to click on the links that you pasted, but I did see them. But I didn't quite get the COA that you mentioned about. Can you say that again?
There's a CLA, the Contributor License Agreement, that you need to sign for the CNCF. Basically, before we can accept any code, it's a legal requirement.
Okay, fair enough. I'll take care of that too.
Cool. Yeah, so go ahead and take a look at those issues. All right, so back to Michael's question. So I think the question here is, I think maybe we should start the conversation. There are a number of issues open in the cluster API repo for creating the new sort of provider-specific repositories. I'd go ahead and create one of those for Azure, and we'll see if we sort of meet the bar of having sufficient ownership to have a SIG-sponsored repository.
Okay, cool.
Can I at least suggest that we start the it's not the implementation code, and then that just be the first PR?
You're breaking up, Chris. I think what you said was start with sort of an empty repository, but not the implementation to get it started. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and then the first pull request would just be the code that we have today.
That sounds good by me.
Cool. I mean, I think before we worry about that, though, we need to make sure we meet the bar for having a repo, which is the process we're going through with the other ones right now.
Yeah, definitely. We can get that ball rolling, I think, then.
Cool. Thank you.
So a quick question here. So you don't have any history to, remember that you need to bring in?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
For the commits, Chris was saying that the first PR would have the code, so you don't need to preserve any commit history.
I don't see any immediate reason why that would need to happen. Why would need to preserve that? No.
Okay, thank you.
The only reason I can think of would be if there was licensing issues. As long as you had an Apache 2 license in the old repository, we should be fine with that approach.
Yeah, it's been Apache 2 the entire time, so we should be good for that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So we'll move to the next one, which is Jason has an action item, which is sort of a follow-on from yesterday's SIG cluster lifecycle meeting about transfer of ownership to Kubernetes SIGs for the cluster API provider AWS repository, which is currently in his personal repo. One of the requirements for us as a SIG to create a new repository is to have a vote via lazy consensus that we actually want to take ownership of this repository. Jason, do you want to say any other words before we initiate lazy consensus voting?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is right now the repo is just a bare bones skeleton implementation of a provider. There's no real implementation code there. It's just enough to basically spin up a no-op cluster controller and machine controller. And the goal is because there have been multiple kind of POCs from different organizations for an AWS provider. I wanted to see, make sure that we can kind of agree upon a design spec before we kind of go forward. That way we're not just picking one of the existing implementations as kind of the starting point. And then right now the owner's file and the owner's aliases file is pointing to the stakeholders that I've identified so far. So if there's anybody else that's interested in collaborating on this or has currently been working on something, please reach out to me so that we can get you involved as well.
Thanks. So I'm going to do what we did yesterday in the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting, and please put a +1 or abstain or put a -1 into chat for our lazy consensus vote for adopting the cluster API provider AWS. And we'll let that run for a couple minutes so people have a chance to open up chat and vote if they want to. In the meantime, we're going to go on to the next thing I put in here for DIMS, which was since last meeting, we've got our first cluster API provider repo created for OpenStack. So I just wanted to do like a quick yay, round of applause. And thank him very much for figuring out the path for doing that and sort of getting the ball rolling. I think it's made it a lot easier for the rest of us to make progress. And so I just wanted to thank DIMS and also point people in that direction. If you are interested in contributing to an OpenStack implementation, please head over there and start working on it.
And I'd like to second that as well. The work that you've done, DIMS, has made you know, adding a new repo significantly easier. Thank you.
I do have a meta question. I don't know if people can hear me about if we assume, is a controller going to be tied to a particular like bootstrap tool, like for example, kubeadm? So for example, if there's one that uses kubeadm and one that doesn't use kubeadm, are those going to be two separate controllers in two separate repos, or one or two controllers in one repo, or do we have any ideas about how that might be structured?
So this question's come up a number of times. In the past, what has been said is it's possible we could share the same repo and have multiple implementations within it. Since we've never seen that happen, I don't know if anyone's thought further ahead about how that would work.
Yeah, I think what we've tried to say in the past is we'd like to, put all the AWS code in one repo, and there can be multiple implementations in that repo. But it would be nice to kind of keep it together. We can share vendor dependencies on, AWS client libraries and so forth. That may not end up working in practice. I think that may be idealistic, but I think we should start there and see if it works.
Yeah, just because it implies something about the naming, but yeah, so we can do AWS, and that's great.
So could I'd like to chime in here as well. Ideally, I think we'd want to design the implementations in a way that they can be, basically vendored in to, for lack of a better term, a meta controller that could potentially implement multiple providers as well. So instead of just having an implementation that is only used for the specific providers, it'd be great if you can actually import that code into a custom controller.
You're too far ahead of us, Jason.
Did that answer your question, Justin, or did you want to dig into that a little more?
No, I think it did. I think that is a great position. I don't have any objection to it, and I was more just worried about getting the name right now for where we intend to be. So it is whatever we're calling it, controller-AWS and not controller-AWS-kubeadm. So, which makes sense.
I think ideally we'd avoid the sprawl of having -AWS-kubeadm, -AWS-Ansible, or whatever else sort of implementation technology, and because those are potentially going to change over time anyway, right?
Yeah, and I think I agree that most of the surface area, at least with regards to the controller, is going to be interacting with the cloud, and maybe a smaller shim that passes through the script that triggers off kubeadm or the script that triggers off Ansible.
Right. In general, we're sort of going to have two controllers. There's going to be the cluster controller and sort of the machine controller. And the cluster controller hopefully will have lots of sort of shared code for setting up the VPC and whatever else needs to be there, the firewall rules, the service accounts, et cetera. And that hopefully will be consistent. And then maybe the node bootstrapper part, we might have something that runs node up or something that runs kubeadmin or something that runs a shell script. And maybe there's some slight tweaks there. But again, there should be hopefully a large body of shared code of create the VM, and then maybe the thing you do on that VM is slightly different. So that's the goal. We'll see how it works in practice. But I think we should definitely start with that end state in mind.
Agreed.
Sweet. All right. I'm going to move this next one back up because it seems like the first lazy consensus vote has finished. So we'll do the second consensus vote, which is sort of in line with the same thing that Jason said. I've created a seed repository for Cluster API provider GCP. Basically, what I did here is I took the skeleton that David created, which was really, really nice place to get started. And then on top of that skeleton, I layered in all of the commit history for the Google provider code from the Cluster API repository. And then I added a cluster cuddle shim in the same way that DIMS did in OpenStack. And then I tested it and verified that using the new sort of code, new if you will, not the vendored code, we still create clusters in exactly the same way, which is great. And so also with the PR I submitted yesterday to delete GCP deployer, I believe once this provider is created, then we can rip out the Cloud Google directory from the main repo, which would be great because that gets rid of some code, but a whole bunch of vendor dependencies that we don't want to be in our common libraries. So like the other one, we're going to do another sort of lazy consensus vote. I will paste the same starty thing in here. There we go. And go ahead and vote on that if you'd like to, while we move on to the next thing, which is Daniel, PR number 414. We talked about this a little bit last week. So for people that weren't here, do you want to give a little background and then we'll try to actually get a resolution?
Sure. Yeah, the short of it is that Cluster API started with a provider config, and then later provider status was added. And then, looking back at the typical Kubernetes API convention, there's a pairing of spec and status. So I just wanted to raise the question of whether we want to, update the original name and change it from provider config to provider spec, since that would be more consistent with, the Kubernetes API conventions.
So I guess one thing I'll say in terms of background, so the provider config is underneath the spec for a machine or for a cluster. Do we know if there are any other places in the Kubernetes API surface that have sort of layering of specs? So you have like a spec with a spec below it?
Yeah, it's pretty common to have multiple specs, especially when you look at things like templates. I can probably think of 4 or 5 examples off the top of my head.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that there was some precedent for that and we weren't going to be setting a precedent. Because it sounds like it stutters a little bit to me when I think about like you have machine spec with provider spec underneath it. But as long as other people are already doing that, that seems fine. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns?
Wasn't there a related question about whether there should be a corresponding provider config or provider config status? Are those unrelated? When I think of the spec model, I think of it in terms of you have a spec because you also have a status, because that's the pattern. With a component config, why is it called component config and not component spec?
So component config is like a kind of like a config map, right? Where it's just a data value. It's not something that has sort of desired and actual state, right? So it doesn't really have a spec and a status. It's just a blob of configuration. And I think that the reason we named it provider config in the first place is we intended to be the same way. You'd have a spec for a machine which says the machine should look like this, and then here's a blob of configuration inside of that spec that sort of defines what that spec is. Now, I do agree that the naming is kind of confusing because we have machine spec, we have machine status, and under machine status, we have provider status, right? Which, so then the naming starts to become confusing. So I think Daniel's right that like, in terms of history, kind of it made sense, but now the naming is out of sync. And I have no objections to sort of bringing that naming back in sync at this point. I think that, functionally for most people, it won't make a difference. But if it's a little bit clearer to people, especially who are new looking at it, and it's more consistent with the way that the rest of Kubernetes does it, then that seems like a good change to make.
Anyway, no hurry on this. If anybody wants to, just leave comments to the PR, we can bring it up again. I thought it would be something good to bring up, while we haven't, we haven't gone at least to beta for the API. So.
Yeah, and does anybody have any objections to changing this? I think it's something we should probably just go ahead and change sooner rather than later.
I agree we should change. And then I just want to kind of mention that a little bit later, we're talking about moving the API to alpha. So if we are going to be changing API field names, now is definitely the time to do it. And in the future, once we move to alpha, we're going to need to be a little more wary about making changes like this.
Plus one from me.
Cool. Daniel, do you want to go ahead and send a PR to make that change? Okay.
Yeah, I'll do that right now. Or,
soon, yes. Yeah, you should probably listen to the rest of the meeting before starting a PR.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so next, I just wanted to give a quick update on the PR backlog. I went through last night, or yesterday, I guess, and tried to merge a bunch of stuff and poke other people to merge a bunch of stuff. We're now down to 6 open PRs. I believe that only one of them is under super active development, which is the validate cluster. I saw updates from that in the last day. One of them is mine, and I need to get back to that, so I expect that to get finished also. And then a couple of the other ones have stalled out. I didn't necessarily want to close them quite yet, but I think at some point the bot will come through and start bugging us about closing those as well. But I did want to give an update. I think I'm trying to do a little bit better job of grooming the PR backlog. So I think Dims, you might have been on the hook to set up the auto assigner. I haven't seen that kick in yet. So in the meantime, I'm trying at least once a week to go through, make a pass, and make sure we're keeping the queue moving. So happy for anyone else to help with that. Also, if people want to jump on that and try to keep it moving as well. Let's see. So next, this I found while going through issues yesterday about so just to jump ahead a little bit, we have an issue about alpha exit criteria. I started going through the list of things in the alpha milestone, and I found 2 issues that Dims asked if they were dupes. And I think that they are not actually dupes. They are actually sort of suggesting 2 alternative solutions for getting the basically the kubeconfig from a deployed master. And so one of them is, right now we have this provider specific SSH code. We should make that provider independent and maybe use the Golang SSH libraries to actually implement SSH to fetch that kubeconfig. And the other suggestion is we shouldn't use SSH at all. We should figure out a different way to extract this thing. I think obviously I don't think we should do both, right? We should pick one direction and move forward with that one direction and have providers implement the same thing. Especially if it's SSH, that's going to become sort of a requirement for the providers to implement an SSH. And the other issue, Karan says he's not sure how to do it without SSH, but he thinks we shouldn't use SSH. So I wanted to bring this up and see if people had thoughts. We don't necessarily need a resolution during this meeting, but I wanted to get in front of people to start people's brains thinking about whether we thought a generic SSH solution is a good idea, and if we can avoid SSH, if people have ideas about how we could avoid SSH.
Issue 1 through 2, a trivial way to get the CA certificate, if you trust that, is just to request, initiate an HTTPS connection. You get the certificates, right? But
that gets you the serving cert, right?
I think it
So
depends how it's configured, whether it's sent to the chain or not. Good point.
I guess that's true. So I think what we need, so if you think about what's in the kube config, we need the endpoint, so the IP address. Once you have that, you can potentially try making connection to get the serving cert and hopefully the CA cert. And then we also need client credentials. So it's the endpoint to actually make that request and the client credentials to make the request successfully are still 2 things we need to extract.
Right. One more thing here was we need these to get rid of one of the methods that is causing us to proliferate clusterctl main.go. So that's the other background here.
One of the things we had talked about when we first started talking about how to solve this problem, I think last year, was coming up with some sort of proprietary protocol, maybe over gRPC using TLS, that would allow a bootstrapped machine to act as a server that we could push cert material and the endpoint for the API server to, and have a static binary that the machine bootstraps with that knows what to do with that information. That at least gives us a little more flexibility, and we're not introducing a dependency on SSH, but effectively solves it in the same way. So just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, so I think that's the opposite direction, right? So what we do today is, at least in the GCP implementation, we run kubeadmin init. That creates the admin.conf, and then we SSH in and we suck that out. What you're proposing is, instead of running kubeadmin init and letting that generate the certs, is that we basically make an RPC call that pushes some cert data down and tell kubeadmin use that instead of generating your own, and then we have a copy of it because we handed it in, right?
Exactly, yeah.
One problem with SH or this approach is that you have to have network connectivity to the nodes, and in some cases when they're behind network NAT or some other means, and the controller needs to have network access. And especially if you have like a bastion jump node to do SSH for more secure environments, I'm not sure how this thing can work.
Yes, so I think specifically when the worker machines are in the private network and controllers are running outside, then it becomes really a problem. How do you SSH into it? And as Martin already mentioned, you have to go via bastion and so on. But one of the way could be generating the cloud config or cloud init kind of configuration at the master, at the controller level. And while bootstrapping the machine, we can just inject that, and then while injecting, we would know that the cloud config knows what's the endpoint of the API server, what are the necessary certificates, what is a bootstrap token, all of the information that you could provide, and even there are other configurations for the machine, you can just feed those things in. But I'm not sure whether it would be supported by a larger set of operating systems. But most of them, I think, would say.
So I think the main problem there is that gives you input to the machine, but it doesn't give you the output of kind of the bootstrap machine, particularly the kubeconfig that's generated from spinning the cluster up. And I hate to say it, but one option that we have there is to actually pre-generate the cluster CA and pre-generate the admin kubeconfig and pass that into the cluster create.
Is that, it sounded to me like that's what Hardik was proposing, which was basically generate it externally and push it in, via something like Cloud Init, because then we have a copy of it that we've handed off instead of trying to get it back, right? Instead of and that's also in a similar sense what Chris was saying. It's just a difference of how we push it in, which is if instead of letting kubeadmin generate or whatever's running on that machine generate that thing that you have to then extract, is you hand it over and say use this because then I actually already have it a priori.
Sorry, I misheard Hardik.
Is that what you were saying, Hardik? Was
yes.
But then Cloud Init, we are just talking about virtual machines, right? What are the options for bare metal then?
Yes.
I mean, I'm happy because OpenStack it does use Cloud Init, and it's everywhere and everybody uses it. But then yesterday, Jason was saying, okay, what do we do for bare metal?
Well, the other downside, I think, to Cloud Init too is last I checked, Azure and GCP didn't default to using Cloud Init either.
You can use Cloud Init on GCP. Maybe it's not the default. You can configure it to work.
The one technical reason I always struggled with embracing Cloud Init and why I mentioned the writing our own protocol earlier was Cloud Init doesn't really have a good solid way of reporting status if it failed or not. And if we're going to be trying to track the status of a machine that we're deploying, being able to get information about did it succeed successfully, and if not, what exactly went wrong is going to be pretty important to us.
Right, Chris. Then the other thing that we are asking to do is like inject another binary which is not there on the machine, right? To start up the gRPC listener, which we can talk to.
Yeah.
So that's the additional component that we need to run.
Yeah, and I don't have a good technical way of getting that binary onto a server other than, you know, baking it into the image or, you know, making that an implementation detail that we don't care about. But again, yeah, it's kind of 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. We still need to figure out how to get that binary on the server as well.
In terms of the difference between SSH and gRPC, I think the issues that Hardik and Martin were talking about with connectivity probably apply equally to both of those. gRPC, I think, has a clear security win in terms of being a lot more restrictive in terms of what you can do over that connection. But we may still end up with problems where we can't actually initiate that connection if we're in one of these situations where you have a bastion or a trampoline or some sort of NAT system in between you and the nodes, right?
There was actually a really interesting PR into COPS recently, which is not specific to COPS in any way, which is sort of trying to find a more secure alternative to the kubelet certificate bootstrapping, which actually has, you know, obvious parallels to what we're talking about here. And that did use a server component and a client component. I think it was actually using JSON and REST instead of gRPC, but we could easily like look at that. I'd love to get that out of COPS. I mean, it's great that it's in COPS, so I'd love to be like, you know, have it not be specific to COPS, right? That it's a fairly high complexity piece that is very reusable and not specific to COPS at all. And that would then establishing that. So basically, Chris's suggestion that we have a well-defined protocol that can do some of our actions that we want to do, like passing around credentials, like bootstrapping certificate chains, I think makes a ton of sense.
Maybe our previous discussion about having multiple implementations for different use cases for single cloud provider, right? This is directly brings in there. So if you have different use cases such as SSH versus no SSH, then kubeADM versus generic way of doing it and stuff like that, then maybe our previous conversation makes more sense then.
Yeah, I think one of the things was, this is, as Dim's mentioned, this is related to one of the sort of generic functions that we want to get rid of to make cluster cuddle not have to be vendored the way it is today. And so we do want to have a way to at least part of this information, right? So I don't think that cluster cuddle cares about the entire kubeconfig, although I could be wrong. Maybe it just cares about the IP. Although I guess that's probably not sufficient. It probably still needs the client credentials and the server cert, right? So yeah, maybe it is.
I mean, so right now you can generate for every single machine a bootstrap token, for example, and this is the only thing, and the IP address of the server to get the kubelet, the needed credentials. So it can bootstrap itself. So I mean, those are basically the only two things that you need for a successful bootstrap, and you can generate per machine credentials as well, which is the real good thing. And because you have full control over the lifecycle of that machine, you can specify, okay, my machine is booted. I'll directly remove the bootstrap token, and it will be secure. In my honest opinion, much better than other solutions where the credentials are pretty much there for quite some time, and they're shared between, for example, the different, and they're shared in the same deployment.
So are you doing that today? Are you generating, I think that's what the PR does, but with sort of like a handshake, whereas it sounds like what you're doing is even more secure than what that COPS PR does, where, you know, the machine controller is creating the bootstrap token and injecting it just into the machine. And are you Are you actually doing that today?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I will have to have a look at how you do that. That's awesome. Because that is an even better approach, right?
So I think the downside there is currently Cluster Cuddle is also trying to be able to apply add-ons, and it is also kind of staging the machines to deploy the control plane machine before the worker nodes. And to be able to do that, it needs to be able to check the status against the cluster. So I think that's one reason why we still need the kubeconfig right now. And I don't know if there's a decent workaround around there unless we somehow precede like a service account that we could use to call into the cluster.
I am certainly in favor of preceding that is what COPS does, and I think the COPS does it sort of by mistake because we have to store it somewhere persistent. So we store it in S3, we create it, we put it in S3, and then the masters actually pull it, and the nodes actually pull it from S3. That does seem like a simpler workflow than spinning up a machine which creates a certificate, which we then extract, but at any stage that might fail, and we're not exactly sure where it failed, right?
In fact, for the future, when there are, let's say, when we have an HA cluster and CA or various keys need to be certain keys need to be shared across the masters. Is there going to be any alternative to exposing those in some way or bringing those back in some way to either Cluster Cuddle or the controller?
So if you can actually access into the cluster with sufficient permissions, you can actually run commands on the nodes through, pods. So you don't necessarily need access to the machine. You just need to be able to run pods on that machine to be able to access what you need.
I think, Daniel, you have a really good point, though, because one of the struggles right now with kubeadmin trying to do HA is if you have multiple masters, how do you actually distribute the cert material across those machines securely, right? And systems like COPS get around this because they are an actor at a higher level that is, able to say, here are my 3 master machines, put the material on those 3 machines, whether it's via S3 or other systems do it in a different way. And having that sort of more global view of the control plane makes that problem a lot more tractable.
And I can speak to that a little bit. The way that we're trying to do the etcd cluster management for HA right now is in kubeadm is to run commands against that first etcd pod to be able to query data about it and then join additional nodes to that cluster. So you don't have to kind of precede and transfer that data around. We extract it from the running pod and run commands against that running pod.
Yeah, I think it's true. You don't have to precede, but you do at some point. You have to whether you generate the CA certain key. I guess doesn't matter. You could do it at let's say that first master, or that first etcd member, but eventually you have to pull that out and transfer that. And if we're going to need to see that, if the orchestration layer is going to need to have a copy of that, in the future for HA clusters, maybe we can take advantage of that for for the kubeconfig problem right now.
All right, I think I'm going to call it on this discussion for now. We have 15 minutes left and a few more agenda items. I did want to bring this up. I think we've had a really good discussion about it. Hopefully people walk away and this keeps sort of churning in the back of your minds. Maybe we can come back to this in a week or two and see if anybody has any brilliant ideas. The next thing, I found an issue that had been open quite a while ago about vendoring Kubernetes into the cluster API repo. I thought we discussed this during a meeting, but I couldn't find anything in meeting notes, so I wanted to bring it up briefly here and see if anybody wants to keep this issue open or if we can agree to close it. Does anybody think it's a good idea to vendor all of Kubernetes into our cluster API repo? I don't mean that to be leading.
As someone that does this in COPS, I can tell you it is not a good idea.
+1 to not doing it.
I think I specifically removed this thing from the repository.
Okay.
At least I don't see it anymore. So
cool. I'm going to go ahead and close this. If someone wants to reopen it, we can restart the discussion. So next, I linked to an issue that Rob had created about exit criteria for the cluster API alpha release. And I don't know, is Tim on the call? Let's see. Tim had added a couple of comments here that I wanted to dig into with him, but I don't see him. So maybe we can discuss that part next week. But the main takeaway here is if you're interested in when we might have an alpha release or how you can help get us to an alpha release faster, please take a look at this issue. Rob put down a couple of different requirements, some of which we've met by now and others we haven't. And then also a link to a milestone for GitHub issues. And there are currently 19 open GitHub issues in the milestone. The idea is to burn that down to 0 before we say we're ready to cut a release. It's a little bit circular because the exit criteria issue is in the milestone, so it can't actually be 0 unless we actually close exit criteria 1, 2. But the idea is basically all the other things in the milestone are things that we think we need to do before we can call ourselves alpha. So I did a quick pass over all sort of 100 or so open issues last night and put a couple of extra ones into the milestone. There were a couple I kicked out of the milestone. I think it's about right for what we want to call the first release. A number of them are GCP specific, and I expect those issues to migrate over to the provider GCP repository once that exists, so the list should get a little bit shorter at that point. But in general, if people have thoughts about what should be in the milestone, please poke issues, add them to the milestone directly, or update the exit criteria issue if you have thoughts. I wanted to walk through some of the details, but we're a little bit short on time, and since Tim's not here and he wanted to talk about testing and releasing, we might want to postpone that discussion until next week. Unless there's anything else other people want to say about this.
I'm probably going to try to start knocking some of those off in my free time, just because I know it would help us internally here. So hopefully I'll get some coding time in here in the next couple of weeks.
One question I had was, are we still talking about API server builder thing for the alpha?
You mean API server builder versus CRDs?
Yeah. It's not explicitly mentioned in the issue, but
I don't think I saw an issue last night about that. I know we discussed it last week. We should make sure that there's an open issue, and we should probably put that into the milestone. That we should figure out. We need to figure out at least whether we're going to do that for alpha, in addition to start thinking about the long-term path.
Right.
Because it'll be a chunk of work to sort of move us back. Right.
Yeah. The only thing in that alpha issue is upgrade Kubernetes version, but then that directly leads to the other CRD versus API server builder question, I think.
Yeah, I think there's also an open issue that sort of tangentially touches upon it, which is that we should be able to adopt existing clusters. And I think adopting existing clusters is a lot easier with CRDs right. As with the extension API server. So that's related. Let's see. Daniel proposed in chat that we adopt number 409. Sure, we can adopt that one. Let's change the title of it. I think the title right now sort of states the goal, which is we want to be using more recent version of Kubernetes, I think it might be easier for people to find if we also say, like, should we update using API Server Builder or switch to CRDs? And I'll add that to the milestone. Okay, cool. Daniel's going to take an action to go ahead and update the title of that one. Great. So next, first, actually, before I move on, are there any other things people want to say about alpha exit criteria? Okay. Next, Alberto and John. Yeah, not sure how you pronounce your name.
Hey, hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so my name is Alberto. I work at Redhat. So yeah, basically just wanted to show up here to say hello and communicate that we are investing efforts on the cluster API area. So we are happy to help on anything relevant. So just to give some context, at Redhat, we developed the AWS actuator, which is a kind of OpenShift specific. And we just started to work on making it more generic. So we are definitely happy to work with Jason and the other folks interested in the AWS actuator. So I guess for the very short term, yeah, I guess we like to make sure that there's a clear path to start to collaborate on an initial design spec, as Jason mentioned before, so we can kick off the discussions and start to materialize things in a common repository.
Thanks. And then is your cohort Jan? How do you pronounce the other name?
Yeah, hi, it's Jan.
Jan, okay. One of my guesses was right.
Yes. Yeah, cool.
Cool.
So I'm from Redhat as well. I'm working with Alberto in the same team. And like as Alberto said, we want to engage into AWS actuator, but as well to help with the reviews of PRs, the cluster API repo. So like basically, if there's anything else you can help with, just let us know. Like, we have a team of folks that can help as well. And like any PR or any small issue or any bug to fix be a great chance for the folks to get familiar with the code. So anything, and I can wait to hear more from you and from the meetings. Yeah.
Awesome. Welcome. We appreciate having you guys join. I'll put out the same message I said to Ashish earlier. You guys can search the repo for the help wanted issues to find places where people have already sort of proactively said, like, these are things to jump in on. And then also, if you look at the alpha milestone, those are things that I think as a group we should try to focus on trying to burn down so we can cut a release. And there are going to be some mechanics there about, like, how do we cut a release? What does that look like, et cetera, as we get closer, that we're definitely going to need some people to jump in and help with. So we appreciate having you guys join. Thank you. And last but not least, Ed, we've got 6 minutes for you to talk about the packet provider. Ed, you are muted. I can't tell if you're trying to talk or not.
Thank you. This is Ed Vilmetti from Packet. I'm looking at getting a scope of work and scaffolding information and requirements and specifications to do a provider for Packet. The CNCF CI work is done at Packet as part of the CNCF cluster, which is hosted at Packet. So there could be potentially an internal CNCF use case pretty much right away for the work on that code. I don't have any code ready to commit, but it seemed like a proper idea to open up an issue in the cluster API repo. So cluster API 431 is that issue, and I would welcome anyone who shares this interest to collaborate there. We can collaborate on that or on any of multiple other Slack or communication channels. Thanks.
Ed, so last week, Hippie Hacker and one other person showed up to talk about the CNCF cross-cloud CI system and how that sort of overlapped in some ways with what we're doing for Cluster API. And then you're also talking about the CNCF CI work. Is this overlap with what they were talking about? Or is that
there is an overlap. With the CI work that I was thinking of was specifically the cross-cloud CI work. And that is testing on Packet right now. Hippie Hacker and Lucina and the rest of the Vulk group have been at it and have done quite a bit of work to do bare metal provisioning at Packet. I don't know the distance between what they have done and what the provider cluster API ProviderSpec is, so there may be some existing work that could be leveraged for future work.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to see how much overlap there was between what they were talking about last week and what we're talking about here.
Yeah, there is a cross-cloud CI meeting next week, Tuesday, I believe. Someone could chime in with the exact details, and I intend to have this on the agenda then.
Cool, thanks. All right, with that, we've reached the end of our agenda with 2 minutes to spare. Does anybody else have other things they want to discuss?
Just a quick note from Lucina in the chat. The CNCF CI working group is Tuesday, July 24th, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, and 6 p.m. UTC, and we would love to have you there.
If people wanted to join that meeting, other than knowing the time, how do you get an invite, or what do you dial into? I think that would be useful.
There is a CNCF CI channel on Slack that has a pointer to all of the details, and failing that, Lucina is a good contact for getting an invite. Noted that that's LIXUNA on relevant networks.
Awesome, thank you. I've added those notes to the meeting notes also if people are going back and reading this and maybe are in a different time zone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ed. Anybody else have anything before we call it? Going once, going twice. All right, thanks everyone for joining. I will actually, one last thing, I'll point out that there was a doodle for people to sign up for times for provider implementer meetings, and that we were going to go back and let people sort of take a second pass at. And I think because either Daniel or David was driving that process, and we should have a new note soon about when people who are working on provider implementations can get together and chat about how that's going.
Right, I think that was Daniel. I haven't seen the doodle.
Oh yeah, I sent a link out in the email. Sorry, to the Google mailing list, the Google group.
All right. So if you're interested in those, please go see that email and try to attend the other meetings.
Did you drop that in Slack?
I will. Yeah, I'll do that in a second.
A link to that has also been added to the Zoom chat as well.
Yes, although that's going to disappear early when the meeting ends. So Slack is probably a better place. All right. With that, we're just about out of time. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you guys all again soon.
Thank you all. See you all in the net.
Thanks, Robert. Bye, everyone.